have passages from Exodus 3, verses 1 through 15, the 63rd Psalm, just the first 8 verses, and then from Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 10, verses 1 through 13, and then we have another passage from Luke chapter 13 this week from verses 1 through 9. In our reading from Exodus, our first readings during Lent are capturing iconic moments, if you will, of God's revelation to Israel. This week, it is the famous burning bush incident. Yes, the burning bush in Exodus 3, 1 to 15. Remember, in the life of Moses, he was, before he led the people out of Egypt, he was, he grew up as an Egyptian. Remember, he was saved from the bulrushes in the basket in the river, and then he was raised and becomes the prince of Egypt, right? And then he finds out who he really is, and he ends up killing somebody, and then he goes on the lam, okay? He's like escaping. He doesn't want to get killed, so he escapes, and he goes to Midian. We don't know exactly where Midian is. Midian is where he has this encounter with God for the first time ever. So Exodus 3, verses 1 through 15. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. Being a shepherd is a very good stepping stone job to being a prophet of God. Apparently, it worked for David. It worked for Moses. The idea of the priestly function of the people is as a shepherd. So we're not surprised to see Moses doing this. Father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Okay, so the Midianites had a religion that is somewhat, I'm going to erase this just a little bit, that is somewhat reminiscent of what we get with Yahwism. There's no, it's not the same thing as, but it's kind of like a precursor to type of a deal. Okay, there was known at that time a god whose name was similar to what to Yahweh, that some people worshipped. And it may have been the Midianites. Okay, I don't want to get into that too far. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Very likely, based on the tradition, this Midian was in the South Sinai. There is a tradition, though, that puts it on the other side of the Jordan, to the west, to the east, from there. We're not 100% sure, but Horeb is the name of the mountain for Sinai. Sinai is the more common name, especially in Exodus, but some of the older traditions call it Horeb. When it's called the mountain of God, it was the mountain of God for the Midianites. The word God there is not the covenant name for God. Remember, we haven't heard the covenant name for God. Spoiler alert, that's what we're going to learn today. Okay, verse 2. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing. Ooh, yet it was not consumed. So we got this burning bush, right? Flame as a fire. Yeah, we've seen God reveal himself in fire. It happens after this, but this is one of those first times we see a fire as being a manifestation of divinity. And coming out of a bush, remember, in some religions, the plants were considered to be expressions of divinity, sometimes even worshipped. But we know that there are characteristics of that in the kind of worship that the Midianites may have been up to because of where they were and what we have come to learn about nomadic religions that prosper in wilderness places. If you're going to make a religion in a place where there's not a whole lot of water, you're gonna make plants some sort of representation of divinity. That's just a natural, just a sequential thing. Then Moses said, notice it already says that he looked and the bush was blazing and I must turn, and that it was not consumed. Well then, in verse 3, then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. We're already told that he saw it, right? This is evidence for that we have several traditions that have been intercalated, if you will. Remember, when Scripture got to be put together, the traditions got woven together like a tapestry, like an afghan, like something being knitted together, and they didn't throw away any scraps. They tried to include everything. So that's the reason why we see this repetition sometimes. Verse 4, when the Lord, notice the Lord, L-O-R-D, is in all caps. That's the Tetragrammaton. That's what this story is about. It hasn't been revealed yet, but this is an example of one of the tradition writers in our Pentateuch called the Yahwist. The Yahwist doesn't seem to have any regard for not projecting back the name of Yahweh. The Yahwist will do that. The Elohist, the E writer, the priestly writer, they would be more fastidious about that. But the Yahwist, no, it's Yahweh all along. We don't have to wait for the revelation of the name. Okay, verse 4, when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses! And he said, here I am. When God calls, you got to answer, right? Then he said, come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. In case you're tempted to get closer to the fire, don't. You're good where you are. This is God saying, you're good where you are. You're good where you are. And you didn't realize it, but where you are, something big's going to happen. So take off your shoes because you got to respect it. Got to give it up. Got to give up your props. Got to respect the space. Got to respect the space. This is good. That's what dressing, when I was taught going to, as a kid, that's what I taught, putting on your best clothes for Sunday morning was all about. Was what? Got to give it up to God. Got to give your best. Got to give your best when it's holy ground, right? Okay. Then he said, verse 6. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. By the way, Moses, according to his genealogy, he was from the tribe of Levi. Levi was one of the sons of Jacob. We don't know how many people removed, but there had already at this time been a recognition of an ancestry. Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the God of our fathers, okay? So that's what that's referring to, the God of your father. Like I said, we don't know how far his father was removed from Levi and from Jacob, but know that he was descended from that tribe, okay? The priestly tribe, okay? And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Why was he afraid? Because of the belief that if you did see God, you would die. Yes, the belief was that if you saw God, you would die. So, of course, he was afraid to look at God. Verse 7, then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So, this is the land that had been identified to Abraham as, look, I'm going to give this to you and your generations forever. This is a repetition of that. It is a confirmation of that. Abraham had not received the operations plan on how God was going to accomplish that promise. Abraham did not have that plan. Moses is being given the plan, okay? The thing about milk and honey, one of the things I see that I've read about this milk and honey thing is that honey isn't, the idea of it isn't from bees, but it's that it's from a syrup that's derived from the nectar of certain plants. I don't know about that, if there's any bees in Israel or not. But I haven't been able to fact check that. But this is one thing I've heard, is that when we think of honey, we think of bees. And when the honey that this is referring to is not actually that, I don't know. I haven't done any research on that. But this is one thing I've heard from the scholars. Verse 9, the cry of the Israelites has now come to me. This is God speaking still. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So God has identified. He's saying, I am that God. There's always an identification. When there's a theophany, there's always a revelation of okay, I'm the God who did that for you, okay? And then here's what I'm going to do for you, okay? And he's saying, now here's how I'm going to use you. This is a typical pattern, if you will, for prophetic callings. We see it with Isaiah and Jeremiah and those kinds of things. So come, verse 10. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. There we have it, the operations plan. How are we going to affect the promise, right? Verse 11. But Moses said to God, and this is classic because this is what always happens in prophetic calls. Now, I'm not saying Moses is called a prophet in Exodus. He's not. But is he treated as one? Yes. And is this the experience of a prophetic call? Yes. Okay. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So this is classic. You got to, if your response to God in this situation is, oh, totally, I'm your man, then what that means is you're not expressing proper deference to God. Okay, you gotta say, oh, I know I'm not the right man for the job, but I'll do it anyway. No, God, this is the proper response, okay? Objection is the proper response. He said, verse 12, I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. That's an interesting turn of a phrase, that God would talk about God and sort of, you shall worship God on this mountain. That's interesting. It's kind of a weird thing. The sign is that you will be worshiping. The sign, I don't know. I don't really like the way that's put together, but that's the way it says. This will be a sign that it is I who sent you. When you have brought You're worshiping me here is the sign that it is I who sent you. You'll come here and you'll worship me. Okay, let's move on, right? Okay, verse 13. But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what is his name? The reason why is because they've never learned the name of their God, of the God of their ancestors. They just know the God of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, and here it is in Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am who I am. Now, Ehyeh is an imperfect verb of a first person singular of the verb to be. I am. Imperfect first person singular. The imperfect in Hebrew is incomplete action. There's only two tenses, perfect and imperfect. Perfect is for completed action. Imperfect is for incomplete action. So in the imperfect, which is this Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh, the I am who I, it can be translated I am who I am in the present. It can be translated in the future. I will be who I will be. Or you can translate one as future and one as present. I am who I will be, or I will be who I am. Yeah, all of the above can be properly translated from the Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh. Okay, I am who I am. So it really is kind of it's like a puzzler. It's a puzzler. It's like for Moses, it was like I really wanted more to go on than just I am who I will be, or I am who I am. Moses wanted more. He wanted, why can't it be a God like, I don't know, Tlitnopach or something like that? I don't know. But he gets, I am who I am, which is more of a promise. If you think about it, it's more of a promise of God. It's more of a statement of the solidity of God, the unchangeableness of God. Okay. He said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am, Ehyeh, has sent me to you. The one who is, okay, has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, okay, this is where we have it, the L-O-R-D, all caps, it stands for that divine name, the tetragrammaton. We call it the tetragrammaton because it's tetra, four, grammaton, letters, four letters. And the Lord, the God of your ancestors. So this is the first time we have it simplified as just the four letters. Okay. The God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. YHWH has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations. The one who is. That is the end of that reading. So we have come to pronounce or guess that the way that is pronounced was Yahweh, because Yahweh would be a third person form of that verb to be, meaning he is, or he who is, the one who is. Who is your God? Well, our God is the one who is. I like it. I like it because it doesn't answer our query, but it does give God a lot of room. When you find out a God's name, okay, if you really think about it, this isn't a name. We make a name out of it, okay? But when you know a God's name, you can use that God for evil purposes, for conjuring up stuff, for magic, that kind of thing. All of that was forbidden in Israelite religion. So The reason why we don't know how the Tetragrammaton was pronounced is because they would never say it aloud. And what they would replace it with is the word that means Lord, Adonai. Now, here's a little fun little footnote. If you take the vowel letters from Adonai, the vowel letters, okay, the vowels from Adonai, you put them with the 4 consonants of the Hebrew, the Yod He Vav He, that's when you get the word, Jehovah. Nobody ever said Jehovah, though. Nobody ever said it. So that's the reason why you don't really see that as something that the scholarship has been debunked on that, if you will. So if you ever meet anybody who says, oh no, the name is Jehovah. No, it's not. It never was. That's just something that some scholars made up because they didn't know they didn't know what they were doing. But do you get that? So that's the reason why we don't know that it's pronounced Yahweh. We think it probably was, but we have no proof because nobody ever said it aloud and they never put vowel pointings with those 4 consonants. Okay, all right. That revelation of God and God's name stands there. It doesn't have a lot to do with the rest of the readings during this third Sunday in Lent, but the Psalm 63, 1 through 8, let us look at it. O God, you are my God. Eagerly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a barren land where there is no water. By the way, that word for soul is also the word in Hebrew for, guess what? What thirsts? Your throat, okay? The word for soul, the word for is the word for throat. And we translate it as soul because that's what they're trying to convey. The idea of the soul didn't really exist, though, in Hebrew theology. That's a Greek thing that came later, and now it's like we just take it for granted. But this is what is going on here. It's my throat thirsts for you, my soul, because that's where they saw the throat was the center of that we associate with the soul. Just like when the stomach is where or the heart is where they associated with rational thought. We don't. Brain is rational thought for us. The heart is for emotions and that kind of thing. So you got to keep that in mind a lot of times when we have translations from the Hebrew, because the words that they use don't. Sometimes we have to translate the sense of it as opposed to the literal meaning. Because if we were to translate the literal meaning of this, it would be throat. Okay. Verse 2 of Psalm 63. Therefore I have gazed upon you in your holy place, that I might behold your power and your glory. The holy refers to, possibly it's talking about a temple experience, yeah. For your loving kindness is better than life itself. My lips shall give you praise. Loving kindness, there's that word again in Hebrew. That's chesed. It literally means solidarity. Sometimes it's referred to as, or translated as covenant love, but it always revolves around the solidarity of God. God is one with us. That loving kindness. I think loving kindness doesn't quite get it because of the fact it's like, no, it's solidarity. God's solidarity with, having that, being solid with God is better than life itself. Verse 4. So will I bless you as long as I live and lift up my hands in your name. My soul is content, as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth praises you with joyful lips. Okay, that expression, again, that soul is content. Again, the word throat, and it mentions marrow and fatness. Some translations were as with fat and fatness. What it means is a sumptuous feast. I can remember watching The Survivor back in the day when it first started. I don't even know if it's still on. But they went without food, and occasionally for a prize they would get meat or something like that. And I remember one of the guys talking about how the satisfaction of what it was like to eat meat. And okay, this idea of marrow and fatness. There's a certain kind of thing that we're used to with meat, that the fat. Yes, there's this comfort food experience we get with that. This not trying to offend vegans or vegetarians, but that's the experience, is it not, of those people who are meat eaters? So we're talking about marrow and fatness. It's basically talking about a sumptuous feast. Comfort food. Oh yeah, comfort food. My soul is content. My throat is content, as though I ate a great, nice, filling meal. This is what it means. And my mouth praises you with joyful lips. So notice the throat is content and the mouth praises. Okay, all up, it makes more sense, right? Soul is what we get for throat, though, right? Verse 6. When I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the night watches. Okay, that's the end of that sentence, talking about being content when I remember you and meditate on you. Verse 7. For you have been my helper, and under the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. This is not the only time we see God, the image of God, as a bird, okay, with wings. Jesus uses it as a hen. Some Egyptian pictures of God, whereas God as a bird with a bird's head. This was a common way of expressing deity in the time. Last verse, my soul clings to you. Your right hand holds me fast. Again, there's that word for soul, throat. My clings to you. Yeah, your right hand holds me fast. So many metaphors for God here, right? That's it. We don't do the last three verses because they go in another direction that we're not headed for in here. This is an expression of trust. You could say that this is an expression of trust that Moses had to have in receiving this commission that he did from God, because frequently the psalm is all about that. During our time of Lent, we can also apply it to ourselves, especially if it's something that, especially if we're having given something up possibly for Lent, or taken something on and we're finding obstacles into fulfilling on our commitment, whether it's giving something up or taking something on. We need to feel the contentment that only God can give us, right? That's what this is emphasizing. All right, we are moving on. The epistle lesson is 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 13. And remember, one of the things I've been talking about anytime we're looking at 1 Corinthians, I got to remember that Paul is responding to a letter that came to him asking certain questions. And Paul addresses things systematically through his letter back. Now, in chapter 10, he specifically deals with a question about the consumption of food that's been offered to idols, okay? And this is the context for what he says here. Verses 1 through 13 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. Okay, what is this talking about? Okay, Paul is reading the Old Testament with a midrash. What is midrash? Midrash is when you look at a text and you kind of comment on it, kind of make it, kind of contemporize it. He is he's looking back at the experiences of the Israelites and saying, their experiences are our experiences, okay? All of our ancestors were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. That thing, passing through the sea, he spiritualizes it as a baptism, if you will, into Moses, okay? Okay, not a bad thing. All ate the same spiritual food. Remember, the spiritual food came from the Lord. Remember the manna, the quail that they were gifted with in the wilderness. All drank from the same spiritual drink. Remember the tradition of the rock? Moses taps on this rock and the water gushes forth, okay? All drank the same spiritual drink. So he's referring to those times in the wilderness, and he's contemporary. He's bringing it forward. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. There's a tradition in Jewish lore that rock that Moses tapped followed them. It went with them. So that the question is asked, how did they get water continually? Well, there's a tradition that rock that he tapped follows them. That's not in Scripture, but that's a teaching that was prevalent. Paul, in his midrashic ways, midrash, M-I-D-R-A-S-H, he is saying that rock that followed them, providing them with that water, was Christ, okay? This is a Christian reading, okay, of an Old Testament text. This is what we do with Jesus as our hermeneutic. Verse 5, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Notice, all did this, all did that, all did this, all did that. But God was not pleased with most of them, okay? And they were struck down in the wilderness. One of the traditions that we have is that the generation that left Egypt was not the same generation that entered the land of promise. Not even Moses, remember, because but yet Joshua, that's interesting. Joshua, he may have been, because we know he entered the promised land, we have evidence, at least from that Cecil B. DeMille movie, The Ten Commandments, that Joshua was in Egypt. Okay, and they were struck down in the wilderness. So this is talking about the whole wilderness experience. And if you haven't read it lately, it's in Exodus and Numbers. Leviticus doesn't have, it's all law. It doesn't have any of the movements in the wilderness. But Exodus and the latter part of the book of Numbers tells about all of that. Paul is saying that those experiences are our experiences, our ancestors. Okay. Verse 6, now these things occurred as examples for us. This is what you do when you're teaching an ancient text as midrash, contemporizing it, so that we might not desire evil as they did. So he's saying that those stories are like a warning, like a cautionary tale, if you will. Verse 7, do not become idolaters as some of them did. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. You can find that in in Exodus chapter 24, and it does say it gets translated in our book as and they rose up to revel. Verse 8. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Yes, that's an incident. You can read it, all about it. If you go to, I thought I had the reference here. The book of Numbers, chapters 25, verses 1 through 9. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 9. It tells of a story there where some sexual immorality happens, okay? So this is why you gotta know your Old Testament. Yes, you do. If you're gonna understand what Paul is saying. Verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, okay? There's a footnote there on Christ. Other ancient authorities have the word Lord, okay? We think that Christ is probably the the correct reading, although the word Lord might make more sense. I don't know. We must not put the Lord to this. We must not put Christ. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. Remember the thing that happens in the book of Numbers. I think we've had that lessons on that before. That was Numbers, verse 20, chapter 21, and it talked about the serpents coming and biting them and killing them. Okay. Again, this is what you do when you're doing a midrashic explanation of an old ancient text. Verse 10, and do not complain as some of them did. Oh, the complaining. So much complaining. The murmuring. Okay. And were destroyed by the destroyer. Okay. That is a reference to the many that died as a result of their misdeeds in the wilderness. These things happened to them, verse 11, to serve as an example. This is what I mean by midrash. He's saying, oh, that's an example for us. And they were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Whew. That's quite a thing to say. The ends of the ages have come upon us. Woo! Wow. This is where we go all eschatological, right? The ends of the ages have come down. This is reflects the Hebrew mindset with regard to time, as opposed to the Greek mindset, that time is going in a direction. It's not a circular thing. It's like, no, it's going in one direction and it's got an end point. This is the viewpoint of Paul as well. Verse 12. So if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. Oh yeah, what a great warning, especially during Lent, right? Especially if you've taken on a commitment, whether it's to give up something or take on something but okay, well, you feel good about where you are. Well, okay, that's good, but be careful. You might not. It might not last. Okay. Verse 13. Oh, lovely passage here. Lovely verse here. If you're gonna memorize one verse during this Lenten season, 1 Corinthians 10:13. Here you go. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. That's good, isn't it? Oh my goodness. God is faithful. This is a pill to take to give you strength for whatever it is you need during this Lenten season. I got to move on. I got to move to the Lucan passage, but I hope you take that to heart. And I'd like to hear from you. Here's my request. Maybe this will teach me whether or not you listened or looked at this or whatever. Let me know if you're going to take on memorizing that verse. Good verse to memorize. I know it's a long one, but it's a good one, right? Okay. Last thing, the gospel passage is from Luke chapter 13. Now, last week we heard from Luke chapter 13. You know what? I just realized I have my bookmark in the wrong place. Oh, there we go. Last week we had verses 31 to 35 were about the Pharisees, and Herod wants to kill you, and Jesus said, oh, tell that fox that I'm the hen, and all of that. This comes from earlier in that same chapter, verses 1 through 9, chapter 13 of Luke 13, 1 through 9. Okay. At that very time, there were some present who told him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Now, we don't have any evidence of what this event was about, other than we do know that Pilate was ruthless with people, and his atrocities against the Jewish people are well documented. So the fact that this is a reference to everybody knows about this We don't have to have any, we know, we have evidence already that Pilate did heinous things like this. Verse 2, he asked them, do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, they were worse sinners than all the other Galileans? So even then, people would say, oh, look at that ill that befell them. What did they do to deserve it? This is not a new question. They asked it back then. We still ask it now. Well, at least some people do. Verse 3. No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish as they did. It's like Jesus is totally putting to bunk. That's a bunk idea, the fact that somebody did something to deserve evil. Bunk! Jesus calls bunk. Okay. Continuing that, verse 4. Or those 18 people who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them. There is in the southeastern part of the city of Jerusalem, where this was. Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? These are things that we would see come up on the internet today, or in the newspaper, right? Or in the 10 o'clock news or whatever, right? So he's just referring to some contemporary events and asking, what? You think these people did something to have them deserve that? No, verse 5. No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did. We've all got foibles. None of us are righteous. If you think that you're better than somebody else because they committed some sort of a heinous deed and you didn't, think again, is basically what Jesus is trying to say. That we are the ones who make those judgments against other people, and we're the ones who prop ourselves up as, oh, I'm better than... You might not say that, but you think it. You think it, all right? Verse 6. Then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it, and found none. So he said to the gardener, see here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Frequently in the Old Testament, we have prophetic, poetic images of God as a vineyard keeper, gardener, and Israel as his people. So the idea of a fig tree being planted by God, very much in line with Hebrew Bible imagery with regard to God and God's people. Okay. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil? So he said to the gardener. He replied, Sir, let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down. And that's the end of the reading. We're always being given grace toward manifesting the kind of righteousness, if you will, justice, purveyors of peace. There's always time for us to get on that train, okay? Jesus is trying to help us toward that. We don't want to presume upon God's grace. We can't take God's grace for granted. We must act as though, hey, I got to get my together, okay? If we don't, we will find ourselves testing God by saying, okay, I'm going to just hold on to this little foible. I'm not going to open this up to you. And I'm just going to, consider that you're testing God. Consider that your unwillingness to totally give in to what it is that God wants for you and for your life and for your being, and that whatever that is that you might need to go away from, that you have been a part of. Maybe this is that time now, okay? This is what Jesus wants us to consider. This is a great passage for Lent because of that, because it asks us to look inside ourselves and really get honest with ourselves with regard to, am I being who I am supposed to be with regard to God? And what am I putting out there in the world? If we're not asking that question now, we'll never ask it. That's what Lent's all about.